Save that for later. Can you all please? Sure.
Close it out.
You take the melody.
Well, one case of color, is there blues? Blue in it?
Sorry?
Blues with a blue in it. Let's see,
Blue name it. You just made it up. It's about like this.
we just make up a piece.
Let's just do blue monk again a little faster.
Yes,
maybe.
yeah, sure.
That's good there.
Yeah.
Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
In B flat?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's okay.
Alright. I mean, I can play String and Chaser now.
It's
Just
not a
do
color.
that
It's
now.
not a color. It's not a color.
Whatever you like.
Yeah.
In there. Ba-ba-doo-da. Ba-ba-doo-da. You can take the melody, Garry. You can.
No problem. Yep, I got it.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Are you up for Black Again Fantasy?
Yeah. We gotta do it like March though, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty straight, right?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Good afternoon. I'll ask people to kindly take their seats. My name is David Deviney, Senior Curator here at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia stands on Mi'kma'ki, and we support arts, education, and culture on this land. We strive for meaningful partnerships with all the peoples of this province as we continue to live and learn with gratitude and respect in this unceded Mi'kmaq territory. I wanted to welcome each of you to the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia as we come together today to celebrate and remember Garry Neil Kennedy, who passed away on the 8th of August in Vancouver at the age of 85. Within this, I'd like to extend a personal and heartfelt welcome to Kathy Busby, Garry's spouse, Ainsley Thompson, and Peter Kennedy, Garry's daughter and son, as well as their respective families who are with us here today. I first met Garry while a graduate student at the Art College in the 1990s. Garry's insightful feedback, words of wisdom, and support then are things that I've carried with me throughout my career. I feel very fortunate to have been able to work with him in a professional capacity on numerous occasions since, most recently in adapting his book, and what a book, The Last Art College, to an exhibition for the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia in 2016. I'll have to say I feel more fortunate, however, to have counted Garry as one of my friends. Over the years, I came to know a highly dedicated artist, teacher, and supporter of the Halifax arts community, the likes of which we may not see again. I know I speak on behalf of all my colleagues here at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia when I say how deeply missed Garry will be. I'd encourage you to follow along in the program that you've found on your seats, as I will be inviting a few speakers to the podium to share memories and stories about Garry with us. The first person I'd like to introduce is Kathy Busby, Garry's spouse. Kathy.
Hello, everybody. There. Now Garry is unwrapped and with us. This cedar box was made by our friend Wayne Arsenault. Garry would be so pleased to have all of us gathered here, remembering his multifaceted life. He had his art life, his athletic life, his life with Jane, with his children. He had his life with NASCAD, his later life with me. Together, it adds up to a very full life, and the fact that all of you have come out today is such a fitting tribute to Garry. Thank you for being here. I'd like to ask David to come up again.
Thank you, Kathy. At this point, I'd like to introduce my friend, Peter Dykes, Director, Curator at Dalhousie Art Gallery, artist and former director of the Alien Owens Gallery, who will be introducing and speaking on behalf of Alan Barkley, artist and former NASCAD Dean. Peter?
I am most pleased to present on behalf of Alan and Garry's family and loved ones, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Alan has written. Thank you for that. On a personal note, I became an official Nova Scotia resident on 1st of October 1991 when I moved from Toronto to Halifax with my spouse, Jane Ward. So 30 years ago and one day. But the real move was from Queen West to NASCAD, and Garry and the culture that kickstarted here was central to that move. I am now becoming Alan Barkley. Brief portrait of Alan Barkley. He was a dean at NASCAD, president, Emily Carr University in Vancouver, then president of the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto, and president of Laguna College of Art and Design in California. He's now writing screenplays in Lunenburg with Linda Holloway Barkley, and his first feature film with Space Stream Productions is currently in post-production. Alan. Garry was a maverick visionary, an original artist in charge of an original art college. I came to know Garry when I came to NASCAD as a graduate student and then as his dean, and was struck by the importance he held of making his art in parallel to his administrative duties. He took the time to teach a class of senior studio students, demonstrating the importance of creativity despite his demanding presidential workload. But the most important lesson to me was the idea that administration is not a noun, it is a verb. Administration is not about filing paper, it is about doing things. Garry's vision for NASCAD was to shape an environment that educated and stimulated students as an adjunct to the classroom. Garry and those who worked with him inaugurated programs to bring leading contemporary artists to the college to give talks on their work, to make prints, to write books, and in all these ways to be around students as role models and idea sharers. So popular, for example, was the NASCAD Visiting Artists Series, and so well attended that when I was with the Ontario College of Art in Toronto, I heard from the director of the AGO that the most reliable attendees at their lecture series were always NASCAD grads. So attuned they were to potentially learning anything about contemporary art. Garry had an instinctive grasp of leadership, how to motivate others, and to excite them about his next idea, whether it was leasing a loft in New York to be used to accommodate students on the frequent bus excursions to New York, or facilitating students to study for a semester at other international colleges. Garry was a great mentor to me in my role as dean, insightful about people and suggesting solutions to issues which were invaluable in my career. One bit of presidential lore was influential to me later on. Some of you may know that Garry was economical with his words. Garry didn't like to ramble on. Also, why write a page when a few well-chosen words will do the same? I was fascinated to see that Garry not only had his own presidential stationery, but that the stationery itself was quite small, maybe only 4 or 6 inches. So that when Garry wrote his concise message, it would float in the middle, it would not be floating in the middle of a standard 8.5 sheet, which would be oceanic by comparison, and which he always signed, "Thanks, GNK." Garry enlightened and enriched all who knew him, and I feel fortunate to be among those people who can say, "Thank you, GNK." I have a little postscript because this is actually really funny. On a personal note, prompted by Alan's remarks, I have in my archival possession a cherished artifact from Garry. During my administrative career at NASCAD, I worked on a number of projects with Garry at Annalee and Owens. In one particular case, I needed documented approval from him to carry on with our work. He sent me a fax from his personal phone line, so it was formal, and I got the approval with 2 small letters on that oceanic page of printed OK. Classic Garry. Garry, GNK, RIP.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Alan. Again, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Ainsley Thompson and Peter Kennedy, Garry's daughter and son, who will be sharing some memories about their father with us. Ainsley, Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to thank the AGNS and everyone here today. We'd like to thank the band, Lucas, who I'm a good friend with. Ainsley and I, this morning, along with our families, Ainsley's husband Ian and son Isaac, my son Theo, my partner Laura, Kathy, of course, and John and Lorelei. We'd like to welcome you here today to remember our father. Ainsley and I struggled what to say. There was so much. Ainsley sat on the wharf this morning in Northwest Cove and rewrote this. The Cove was where Mom and Dad and a dog named Nellie made their retirement home. We thought about starting with Garry's childhood in Port Dalhousie, but you can read about this. Or we maybe thought about his athletic achievements, which many were to follow: rowing, basketball, track, football, and skating. But you can read about this too. There were the early years when my dad first met our mom at St. Catherine's Collegiate. Jane Whitty was in her own right utterly amazing. She raced stock cars, was the youngest pilot in Canadian history at the age of 15, and even then, she was a fashion icon. I'm going to hand it over to Anne.
Yeah, I'm the crybaby of the family, so just bear with me. They dated, they broke up. A few years later, they found each other again. There was art school, there was grad school in Wisconsin and Ohio. Poor starving student days, poor starving teacher days. First son John was born, and then, in 1967, Halifax, NASCAD, and favorite and only daughter Ainsley. Along with Brandy, the first of two St. Bernards. And finally, 2 years later, Peter. The family was complete. There were a few houses, a cottage in West Jador, and then finally, Larch Street. Our years growing up at NASCAD were utterly amazing. Every day, you never knew what you were going to come home to. A living room covered in tinfoil, students milling about. Oh, how Dad loved the eager minds of his students. Pizza boxes stacked to the dining room ceiling, and a visiting artist. There were many, many family dinners. Mom always insisted that we eat with our guests. Faces around the table included Joseph, Casper, Benjamin, Larry, Mimi, Saul, Vito, Lucy. They were just friends to us. And then there was the NASCAD family. The Fergusons, Jerry and Mary Lou, Heather and Doug. They were our heart and our soul here in Nova Scotia. There was our beloved Dennis Young, who we've just lost. Emmett and Annie Williams, June Leaf, Robert Frank, and of course the Murrays, Jane and John in New York. There was always amazing food, drink, much laughter and conversation stretching into the night. Memories for Peter and I, running through the floors of an unfinished NASCAD buildings when Dad was working in his studio. I used to get 10 cents for cleaning each one of his brushes. Summer job for maintenance for Peter, no resume needed, with the unforgettable Ernie. 1 p.m. every day, Dad would go on a cruise with Peter through the departments, checking out what the students were doing. The students are what Dad loved. There were more art openings than could be counted. There, once again, Peter and I ran around like wild crazies, and never a peep for my dad. He thought it was great. We were never, ever on the outside looking in. We were Garry's kids. But the best of times was when we were together. At home on Larch Street. Saturday mornings were for donuts, hikes at Duncan's Cove, bonfires, and periwinkles. Early morning starts for hockey, skiing, and paper routes. Summers in Florida at the beach as kids, riding on Dad's back like a dolphin. Oh, and then there was the dreaded homework, and he was always there to help. and he never judged. There is no doubt that my dad was an amazing guy. But this side of him, the one he brought home every day, that was just for us. He was our father, he was a husband, and he may have loved this job the very most.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ainsley and Peter. Our hearts have been and continue to be with you. Our next guest is Lucas Pierce, musician, composer, former student, and family friend. I'd like to thank Lucas and his counterpart, Max, who have done the tech support for this program today. And I'd also like to acknowledge Lucas Pierce, Tim Crofts, Jordy Haley, the Chromatic Trio, who are providing the music for the event today. Lucas?
Thanks, David. And in case you don't recognize the songs we've been playing, all of them are songs with colors in their title, because we know that Garry would appreciate such things. I've always known Garry in some capacity or another. He was, in my earliest memories, I thought of him, I think when I learned the word, when I learned the word, my father said that, "Oh yeah, that's my boss." And I was like, "Oh, you mean the man who comes in and already knows my name? And already knows the name of the other kids I'm playing with? He's nice." And from then on, there was a long point in my life of just getting to know him better. He was around more. And then coming in and out of the art education department, and there was a work of his on the wall of remembering names from his grade 4 class, and that was the age I was. And I thought, well, he remembers my name too. And it always made me feel like it was all right and it was good that I was there. Years later, I went to NASCAD, and he was around and I would see him, but it wasn't until I took a class with him where we really got to level with each other, and it was really great. The thing that I remember so fondly and strongly was that Garry had this insight to often focus on the smallest things or the things that I had maybe missed and point out how interesting they were. Along with this, he was always a very strong supporter of the fact that I was doing music while I was at NASCAD, while also painting and writing and photography and video and sound. But he really encouraged me to continue doing music, and that just because it wasn't something that was the path that I was setting out to do in my life. I didn't have piano lessons. I didn't have the standard path to being a musician, and Garry pointed out that could be a good thing. Years later still, Garry became my neighbor and a close family friend. From just hanging out at the cafe in the neighborhood and sometimes having coffee, it was always a pleasant and enriching meeting, and I felt really good about that. When my wife and I had children, Garry was still our neighbor and was a wonderful figure in their lives. Very, very loving and very fun, and a really good person to share a sweet tooth with young children. Always willing to play at their level. Many hat games, many games with pillows, all kinds of absurdity. The time we spent professionally together in Germany was really wonderful and enriching for me, and again got to see yet another side of this incredibly insightful mind that Garry had. Continuing on, just having someone who is You know, a true family friend is something which is, you know, there's nothing like that. And it often goes back to what I thought about Garry from the beginning, which was that he had such a perception and affection for these small things that might otherwise have been left behind. He noticed them, and he enjoyed them, and he shared that enjoyment. So, thanks, Garry.
Thank you, Lucas. Our next speakers, Robert Bean and Barbara Lounder, artists, former longtime NASCAD faculty members, and therefore former longtime colleagues of Garry Neal Kennedy. Please welcome Bob and Barbara.
Thank you, David. We appreciate this invitation to offer these words of remembrance about Garry Neal Kennedy. Like many friends and colleagues here today, we both came to Halifax because of NASCAD. Word was out far and wide, in Bob's case, all the way to Regina, for me, Ontario, about the art that was being made here and discussed at the Art College. Garry Kennedy's leadership at the school, which we had seen in publications of the press, we'd seen in lists of visiting artists from around the world, exciting gallery exhibitions and performances, student publications, and bold new approaches to teaching art, was evident and enduring. Many years later, we remain a part of the artistic community that Garry fostered here, as so many of you do.
Yes, I'm a come from away, like many of the people in the audience today. And I came with the plan to stay here for 18 months and complete the final part of my BFA, and I never left. And I think that's true of many people here as well, and I think it speaks volumes to what was happening here at NASCAD and why so many people wanted to continue the relationship with the institution and what we were receiving there. Our first impressions were that Garry was very visible. His office door was always open, and he was present and active in all aspects of college life, from attending artist talks and performances to taking lunch breaks in the cafeteria. Garry quickly got to know new students and staff by name and would recall people and their work years later. So here we are remembering Garry, who had such an amazing memory and who remembered us all. And it would be often, we'd be talking to Garry and he would ask, oh, well, how's so-and-so doing? And it might be somebody from 35 years ago, somebody who I barely remembered. And he would want to know how they were doing. And I realized at that point in time that he knew us all. He knew us all by name.
Garry knew that artists teach best by example, by mentoring, and he welcomed exciting and truly interesting people to come here to study, to teach, to publish books, to make and present their artwork. Garry created an environment where preconceptions and assumptions about art were upended. He believed in a life deeply committed to art and to working hard at what you did, whether it was paper making or performance art. His own practice was founded in painting, but ranged over many media and processes.
I remember shortly after arriving in 1976, starting my classes in 1977, and the first visiting artist talk I went to was Vito. And I left that talk, it was a long pacing lecture that went on for about 2 hours, with a completely new perspective on what art is, what art could be. And it was that kind of mentoring that took place just in the exchange of artists coming to talk about their work. It was an extraordinary experience for me. Garry's teaching and academic structuring of the educational community and experience at NASCAD reflected this interdisciplinary and intellectually generous approach and has been of enormous influence in many contexts. His legacy is alive and abundant in the alumni, publication, artworks, and discourse encountered around the world and threaded through generations. And I also just have to note, and I'm sure many people noticed this as well, that when we heard that Garry had passed, that all throughout Facebook and social media, there were all these posts of people remembering all the kind of anecdotes or just moments of encounter with Garry and how that had basically made something very important in their life happen. Garry remembered and saved things. His book, The Last Art College, is an invaluable resource for teaching, research, and art practice.
We remember Garry in the years since his retirement from NASCAD as a generous host and a friend who, with his wife Kathy, made warm and welcoming homes on Princess Place here in Halifax and then on Quebec Street in Vancouver. We think about Garry's prowess at Scrabble. He often won. He was always delighted. His stories of travel, of living in China, and of new art projects. His pleasure in making new friends and of staying in touch with old ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara and Bob. I'd like to bring Kathy back up here to share a few letters she received from Benjamin Buchlow, Martha Wilson, and Casper Koenig. Kathy.
I've been so heartened and touched by the overwhelming number of notes and letters of condolence I've received since Garry passed away. Since I've been back in Halifax, people have shown such kindness, dropping what they're doing to help out while sharing their memories of Garry, eager to talk about him. Now I'd like to read a couple of those letters. Casper Koenig thought he'd have some words ready for this memorial, but I haven't received them yet, so it'll have to wait till the next one. We're actually having 4 memorials for Garry, and this is the first of the 4. The next one is next weekend in St. Catharines, Garry's childhood home. The next one will be in Toronto at Art Metropole. We're not quite sure yet if it's going to be at the end of November or early in the new year. That's the way it rolls. They have a new space and renovations are going on. And finally, in early January, there'll be a memorial for Garry at Western Front in Vancouver. You're welcome to join any of these, and hoping to do live streaming. So the first note is from Martha Wilson. She says, "Please read the following statement from me at Garry's memorial. I owe my art career to Garry Neil Kennedy. As president of NASCAD, he created an unparalleled visiting artist program through which I met Vito Acconci, Simone Forti, Dan Graham, Saul LeWitt, Alistair McLennan, Pat Olesko, Dennis Oppenheim, Steve Reich, Lawrence Weiner, and most importantly for me, Lucy R. Lepard. Lucy told me, yes, you are an artist, and put me in her circa 7500 show, the catalog through which I met Jackie Apple, Alice Aycock, Nancy Kitchell, Rita Myers, and other women artists who lived in New York. It all started at NASCAD, where Charlotte Townsend gave me my first exhibition in the mezzanine gallery. I owe my art career to Garry Neil Kennedy." And I have a letter from Benjamin Buchlow, former editor of the NASCAD Press, the second editor after Casper. He sent it to be part of Garry's 80th birthday book, and in subsequent years, Garry enjoyed me reading it to him. Benjamin let me know a couple of days ago that he'd be honored if I read it on this occasion. Garry Kennedy, a painter on the edge of the world. Some of the best years of my life I spent at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, Nova Scotia, as the second editor of the Nova Scotia series, and as a faculty member teaching post-World War II art history. It was thanks to Garry that I'd been appointed in 1976, as everything at the college at that time seemed to be the result of Garry's extraordinarily courageous vision, matched by an inimitable subtlety and tact, and perpetual devotion to the projects of the school. Since his achievements as the man who made the Nova Scotia College become the last art college are now well known, not least because he devoted a few years of his well-deserved private life in retirement to the precise and exhaustive account of the exceptional story and stories of that school and its multiple accomplishments in the volume, The Last Art College. I want to talk rather about one of his paintings, which has remained utterly unjustly, almost all but unknown outside the parameters of the Canadian art, outside of the parameters of Canadian art. One of the enchanting rituals during my life at the college from 1976 to 1981 were the late evening hours Garry, his then closest friend, the late Gerald Ferguson, and myself spent in the adjacent studios and offices at Duke Street. All three figures were working often until midnight on their respective projects, interrupted by short mutual visits engendering conversations during which all types of issues, local and international, aesthetic and political, pragmatic and prescient, were discussed. And it was during these evenings that I saw Garry paint, over a period of quite extended time, one of the most peculiar and utterly unforgettable paintings, the type of work that one calls with hindsight a masterpiece, because one recognizes that it actually changed crucial parameters of painting at the time, changes which were hard to detect and to follow for most spectators, hence its relative lack or late recognition. It was a painting which Garry covered almost ritualistically every night with additional layers of chromatically differentiated paint, leaving the minute edge of the additional coat visible so that one could still trace and verify the sheer number of coats and colors, but one could detect these only from the painting's edge. By contrast, the painting's frontal plane steadily increased in thickness of pigment deposits, and its inevitable accumulation of tones and values would acquire a deeply resonant, achromatic, matte brownish surface. I don't know what happened to the painting or the paintings, since I seem to remember that Garry might have painted several according to these peculiar principles that I had never seen anywhere and have not seen since. These late night paintings slowly and steadily built up a structure which made you look at the side of the layers of paint application, its edges, so to speak, in microscopic accumulations that added up to a peculiarly obstinate and almost impermeable surface of a withdrawal, if not rejection, of frontal visuality, in favor of seeing the edge. But on the sides, stepping to the rim of the painting, the place where one would normally not consider a painting's attractions to appear, you would have found an extraordinary lucidity of chromatic interrelationships and structural and textural formations, performing the age-old mysteries of painterly process and chromatic effects as though presented through the magnifying glass of Garry's critical and skeptical intelligence. It matched the intelligence and refinement of reflection that painting at that time had acquired in the work of Robert Ryman or Gerhard Richter. But there was another dimension that made these paintings unforgettable, at least to the mind of this author. They seemed to literally embody, physically, geographically, the being on the edge, the precarious conditions of a radical challenge to the ruling systems of the art world at the time. Precisely the challenges that Garry Kennedy's conception of NASCAD had enacted on the level of institutional vision. Thanks, Garry, for everything.
Thank you, Kathy, for sharing those letters with us. At this point, I'd like to open up the program to the floor and ask the audience if there are any recollections about Garry that you'd like to share with us today. If you'd like to do so, please raise your hand, and my colleague, Natalie, I believe, will bring a microphone to you and sanitize that microphone between use. We have our first hand. Sorting through some technical difficulties with that portable microphone. So we had a hand, I believe, kind of in the middle.
Perfect. We're just going to see if we can troubleshoot this mic.
Check, 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 check. Check. There we go.
Thank you, Lucas.
I didn't know there'd be an opportunity to say anything today. For those of you who were around in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you'll remember the graduations. It is customary for me at this time of year was how Garry began every one of them. He wasn't fond, I don't think, of speaking in public. I started in '74 taking over from Martha Wilson, whom you've just heard from. I guess I would call myself a refugee from academia. I took the job for a year until a real 19th century teaching job came up, and I stayed 40 years. And I think that is the way that many of you started out at NASCAD. Like Bob, you were going to stay 18 months. It was an amazing place. You could walk into Garry's office. You didn't need to make an appointment 3 weeks in advance. You could say, I've got this idea. And sometimes he wrote okay and put it on a piece of paper. And sometimes he just said, yeah, that sounds great. I can't believe what many of our lives would have been like without Garry. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Louis Comeau, and I was president of St. Anne's, de Sainte-Anne in Church Point. I was the first lay president there, and prior to me were all priests, so maybe I look like a priest. But anyway, Garry was president of NASCAD. Owen Carrigan was president of St. Mary's. the three of us were the youngest of the group. You know, Henry Hicks was at Dal, and Walter Priest at St. FX, and so on and so forth. So Garry, one time, he invited us to his house. On the wall of his living room was what I considered graph paper. I said, Garry, for goodness sake, Garry, that's not art. You're president of the university. That's not art. Oh no, he started giving me every line meant something. And I've always kidded him for many years after that. We had a lot of fun about that graph paper thing that he got a lot of paper for, a lot of money for. Anyway, that was super. Then one time we went, so he had a laugh that wasn't really a big laugh. He just had a big smile on his face, but not much noise coming out. So we went one time, I don't know why, but the university presidents of Nova Scotia, we all went to Jamaica. I still don't know why, but I guess they were a member of our university system here, and they were supposed to be, but there was no meetings that I recall. But Garry and I and Owen Kerrigan had a lot of laughs. We drank some beer, and we had fun. Garry was a fine, fine fellow, and I always kidded him about his graph paper, but he got a lot of money for it. Good for him. Thank you.
Hi, I grew up in this area and just outside of Halifax. In 1967, I was enrolled at Dalhousie University in my second year of regular Bachelor of Arts. And it's the first time in any school year that I didn't get the books. I just didn't feel like getting the books. And at the end of September, I just finally trusted my gravitational pull and walked into the Art College in Coburg Road. Got the elevator up to the top floor and spoke to someone in the office, and I said, I'd like to, come to the Art College. They led me into Gary Kennedy's office. And so I'm in there, and I said hello, and I said, I'd like to come to the Art College. I don't have a portfolio, I've never done anything artistic, but I would like to come to the Art College. And he said, okay. And so I went out and signed up, and I enrolled. And I found out a few weeks later that the enrollment had been closed for a few weeks because so many people, it was full that year. But anyway, he said, okay. The next year, I took printmaking with Jack Lemon. And Bob Rogers was there, and it was the most amazing experience. I don't perspire naturally, but that year, that's when I first started sweating because we worked so hard. And with our lithography studio was directly opposite the printing studio for visiting artists. And one of the highlights of my time at the college was when I looked in the door and stood outside the door and watched Joyce Wieland leaning over a stone and making the words, "Oh, Canada." That has been the most significant influence on my life and my work. So at that same time, there were wonderful exhibitions in the gallery, and I think it was Ralph Pomeroy was the director at that time. And my favorite and most memorable exhibition was one of Christmas trees. You just walked into this beautiful gallery, and it was so fragrant, and the branches would touch your body, and I was in heaven. I'm so grateful that I came to the college. I did end up I took weaving, and that, of course, we were outside of everything because we were in crafts, which were, excuse me, I wasn't seeing the same kinds of things as I was when I was taking printmaking. However, I was so benefited from it. Like the time I rode up in the elevator in Duke Street, and there was this incredible energy on the elevator, and it was me and another man with a hat on. I didn't know it was Joseph Boyce, but he was so, like all of the people, and Benjamin Buchloh was the same, so open and kind. And we had a short conversation, but that was another major influence. So I just want to say, I am so grateful that I went to the Art College and I heard the words, okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrew Terrace, and I've never had any formal connection whatsoever to NASCAD, but I am acutely aware that NASCAD has had such an incredibly powerful influence on the culture of this province and of this country. And a lot of that was due to the leadership of Garry Neil Kennedy. Now, people have talked about his influence as an artist, as an arts educator, as an arts administrator, but there was another aspect to Garry's career that I want to talk about, and that was his work as an arts activist, and I will cite one specific example. And that was in the early 80s when the Mulroney government came to power and immediately started slashing cultural budgets, Canada Council, CBC, et cetera, et cetera. And with the work of Garry Kennedy, Mary Sparling, Sheila Mackenzie, and others, they organized a huge arts assembly that filled the Rebecca Cohen Auditorium with speaker after speaker talking about the specific influence that these cuts would have on their work. That was followed several months later by a huge national conference at Mount St. Vincent University. And basically, the upshot of it was nothing had happened in the rest of the country when those cuts came down. Nova Scotia was the first community that actually rose up in righteous wrath against the slice and dice budgets of the Mulroney government. And after our actions here, a lot of it due to the work of Garry Neil Kennedy, there were protests all across the country. So we led on that fight. And as a result, the Mulroney government backed down. And that's just one small example of the activism of Garry Neil Kennedy.
No, I just wanted to ask.
Great. Natalie, right, we had a hand right here. Then one in the back, thanks.
Long-time listener, first-time caller. My name's Greg. I knew Garry in many capacities over the years. First as a student in my undergrad, and wanting to do projects, I would go up to his office like everyone would, and the answer was always yes. The first time I met him, he had paint chips all over the floor, and I was like, what is this guy doing? And he was like, what do you think of this color? And he's not looking me in the eye because he's looking at his paint chips. It was only years later that I realized that he was in the midst of his creative process. After I finished my MFA, I found myself on the board of the Khyber Building Society, and at that time we were involved in a negotiation with the city of Halifax, which had become HRM, and we were trying to negotiate square footage, and we were way overmatched. We were having meetings twice a week, and they had to bring lawyers and architects. And I thought the only thing we can do is get someone who has some knowledge to come in, and of course that was Garry, because he had built NASCAD and created the campus downtown. And Garry came in, and the first meeting we had with city staff, they brought in numbers, like we want this much per square footage. And Garry looked at us like, oh no, that's a lot of money. We don't want to pay that. And then they said, okay, well, that's how you do it? You just say no? But it's his reputation and what he created that they took him seriously, and he's one of many people who saved the Khyber at different stages, but he really saved the Khyber. Anyway, I really appreciated his mentorship.
I think I've known Garry since I went to NASCAD before Garry came, so I had the fortunate experience to see it from the very beginning. And Garry was, I think Garry was a few words, but he spoke with his eyes. He would either look you in the eye or look down at the floor. And he was like a chess player. His strategy was working all the time, very clear, and he knew the difference between good shitting shinola. And I remember him for those things. Thanks.
Hi, so my name's Tamar Drushka. I don't know about anybody else. I'm having a little trouble hearing in here, so I'm going to shout into this thing. I didn't actually know Garry really personally very well while I was at NASCAD, but I mean, I certainly knew who he was, and I was fortunate enough to spend a week in New York at the Loft with a group of students and Garry. And my fondest memory of Garry is standing in that loft one afternoon. We had all come back, and it had started to rain, and in New York, when it starts to rain, everyone starts selling these umbrellas on the street. And so we all had these black umbrellas. And Garry was looking at all these umbrellas, and he picked them up, and he was holding, they were all pretty much the same. And he was just holding this group of black umbrellas in his hand and looking at them, and he said, "They're the same, but they're different." And that was all he said. He put them down, and that's my very strange memory, most wonderful memory of Garry.
Catherine Knight and I arrived in January 1976, and I want to say thank you, Garry. Thank you for an art school that believed in observation, humor, resilience, and work ethic. And being around in the school and seeing Garry everywhere, it made you love art, but most of all, it made you love the process of making art. And so I say, thank you, Garry.
Hi, my name's Marcy. I wasn't going to say anything, but then Catherine passed me the mic. I actually went to NASCAD as a student in the mid-90s and was lucky enough to take Printed Matter, studio with Garry, and also went on one of those really great New York trips with Garry. And as an instructor, Garry really treated his students like peers. We did a group publication. He was in the publication. We had group shows at the OO Gallery. Like, we were all peers making this together. Your opinion was as valid, given as much space, and he was really kind of, hands off to a certain point, but really created such an incredible space. And then we went on this New York trip where we were really lucky that we got these travel scholarships to go. We all stayed in one room at the Gershwin with some Andy Warhols and everything. And we really thought, Garry and Jane took us, and they were incredible hosts. We thought we were going to get this list of what we were to see and what we were to do, and that really we'd be kind of on our own. Garry got a new baseball hat in the airport, and when we got to the lobby, he put it on backwards, and he looked at all of us, and it was like, "New York, Garry." And he was like, "How long do you need to unpack? 20 minutes? I'll wait here." And it was every day he met us in the lobby, and it was like he had this incredible agenda where we were totally exposed to Garry's New York. Every little alley that we went down in Soho, what the gallery was. He had a private lecture with, of course, Benjamin Buchloh, who met us at the Loft at that time, and it was just 9 a.m. to 2 a.m. Garry Neil Kennedy's New York, and we were all very grateful. And then later coming back to Halifax, being hosted by Garry and Kathy. So I'm grateful for the Garrys that I knew. Thank you.
Keeping in our row. My name is Janet Wallace, and kind of in keeping with what's being talked about, one of the programs that hasn't been mentioned but was quite extraordinary was when I was going to the art college. Garry okayed a program in 1970-71 where 13 of us traveled around the world on our own. And kind of the thing was, as long as you come back changed, you know, and we did. So very grateful to Garry, changed our lives.
I'm the son-in-law. Just got a few stories that I've thought about just sitting here listening to everybody. I related to Garry much more on a sports level. I'm a firefighter, not an artist. I liked doing projects, fixing up the boathouse with him, things like that. But I remember asking him how he could possibly have been so successful as a football player. He's such a little guy. And he said, I was very fast, and you'd be fast too if you were being chased by those gorillas. He had a really good sense of humor. We had a lot of laughs. He loved the sea and the cove where he raised his family. He had no sea legs at all. You couldn't take that man out on a boat. He'd be vomiting off the side in no time. And when I married Ainsley, we kind of hurried up the process because Jane was dying of cancer. We got married at my family cottage in Muskoka, and you had to get into that cottage by boat. So the whole wedding party was waiting, and all the guests. It was a very small wedding. Ainsley came in on our boat with Garry, and Garry walked the bride up the hill, and everybody was on bated breath that he made it in without puking off the side of the boat. He did. He made it. When I was courting Ainsley, I really put my foot in my mouth one time when we were dating. He loved sports, and so did I, but he loved baseball. He loved watching baseball, and I can't stand it. So he offered to take me to a Jays game one time, and I, without thinking, said, I'd rather watch paint dry. And he says to me, Ian, I've spent my entire life watching paint dry, so I have no idea what that means. He took humor and things like that totally in stride. He made it easy for me. But I thought, oh my God, I did not impress the future father-in-law there. And the last thing I just wanted to mention, you read that story about that layer painting, which I know quite well. And I never really understood his art. And I'm trying to remember which showing it was. It might have been the one at the National Gallery. And somebody broke a chunk off the corner of that beautiful painting. And I was like, oh my God, we've destroyed this beautiful artwork. And Garry basically said, that's okay. It's about the process, not the finished work. And he took some glue and stuck it back on. And now I get it. Now I understand it. But he was a great father-in-law, a wonderful grandfather, a great dad, and I love a man who loves his family. I just buried my own father 2 days ago. It's a hard week. Thank you, Garry.
Hello, everyone. My name is Enrique. I'm very nervous, but Garry's son-in-law just triggered a memory of when I was working here as an assistant curator in the education department, and Garry was installing the colors of Citizen Aurora upstairs. And I was walking by asking him questions because I had to prepare stuff for the docents to talk about. And he said, do you think watching paint dry is boring? And I was like, well, that's what everybody says. And he's like, come here. And we stood there for no more than 5 minutes. And he says, look, they were just painting the piece upstairs, so it was like a lot of fresh paint. He's like, look, just really look. Which was funny because it was my job to tell people to look, to really look. And I stood there with Garry and we watched the paint dry. And I have to tell you that I recommend it highly. Because you start looking at the paint, and the paint starts changing because obviously wet paint is moist and it reflects the light. And as it dries, it becomes matte. And then you can see so many shapes, so many things happening in paint drying. So very recommended. Thank you, Garry Neal Kennedy, for that, and many, many other things. And thank you also to Kathy for always welcoming me in their home in Princess Place. And it's just such a privilege and an honor to have met Garry and to know Kathy and to be here today. Thank you.
So I have a follow-up story about the show, The Colors of the Citizen Aurora. I was having lunch at Kathy and Gary's house, and I just noticed that it was one of several lunches, and I just noticed that he was a bit shy. And as someone else said, he would sometimes just look at the floor. And I could totally relate to that because I need acres of silence in my own life. And so I said to him, Garry, I just wanted to tell you, I was so moved by that show of yours, The Colors of the Citizen Aurora. It really made an impression on me. And so he slowly looked up at me through those magnificent eyebrows. And then he looked back down again and he said, I got in quite a bit of trouble for that one. And in support, I replied, yes, but isn't that what artists are supposed to do? So that was that story. And then I just have a tiny follow-up story. The other thing I really loved about Garry was how approachable he was. So I'm walking down the street, Spring Garden Road, with my youngest, who was at NASCAD, and she just stopped as this truck was unloading a whole huge amount of boxes, and she said, oh, I have to take a photo of that and send it to Garry. And every box was identical in size and shape, and it had stamped on the outside of it in huge letters, limited supply. And there was like 300 of these boxes. And so I thought, yeah, exactly, send it to Garry. Thank you, Garry.
Final turn.
Thank you. My name's Craig Leonard. I've been at NASCAD since 2006. Garry was a real mentor to me. I just wanted, there were many stories I could talk in an admiring fashion about Garry, especially about his exhibitions and about our relationship with one another. But the one I wanted to share with you and recount now was his final exhibition. I believe it was his final exhibition, or at least the final version of his Remembering Names show that I had the privilege to see in a very small gallery in Vancouver. And it was, quite honestly, one of the most impactful exhibitions I've seen, because in the room, it's a very, very tiny space, no bigger than 10 by 20 feet, no windows, was Garry sitting in a very modest chair wearing a red baseball cap from his high school team, I believe. And he was writing the names that he could remember on the wall. And what was, for me, incredible about the exhibition and integral, really, to Garry and his artistic process and his conceptual approach to art making was the fact that he was in the later stages of dementia, and this was his process consciously and probably quite automatically by this point, was working through and in this state of late-stage dementia, and the names on the wall were fascinating to look at, mainly for the sake that they were drifting. I think just as his thought at the time would drift in a sense and maybe taper off, so were the lines on the wall of the names being remembered, and it was just an extremely poetic and incredible show. That's the story I wanted to share. Thank you very much, Garry.
Thanks. My name's Jody Zinner, and I just want to thank Garry for engendering troublemakers. I'm a troublemaker, and Garry spotted that in me, and he was unflappable around my troublemaking, and I just have so much gratitude for that. Just how he sort of threw the troublemakers out into the world with a little bit of a grin and supported us through our troublemaking, and we just couldn't flap him. And I just have such deep gratitude for that. So I just wanted to say thank you. And also thank you to Kathy for inviting me into your house all those times and being in there and seeing you and Garry bemused at all my insane stories. And it was just a really safe place to be a troublemaker and to mature through that. And he had these amazing questions that would make me pause before I pursued more chaos. And I just appreciate him so much for that. So thank you, Garry.
Thank you, everyone. That was absolutely amazing. Thank you for sharing those stories and memories with us. Before I offer some closing remarks, I'd like to invite Lucas, Tim, Jordy, the Chromatic Trio, back to the front to play a bit of music as a moment of pause and reflection.
blue and green.
Thank you, guys. In bringing this remembrance to a close, I once again wanted to thank all of our speakers, those on the program, and those of you who raised your hands in the audience to share stories and memories about Garry with us. I'd also like to thank each of you for coming out today. It's really wonderful to see everybody, and it feels so good to be with one another. I'd like to encourage you to sign and add comments to the guest book that is at the entrance to my right, if you haven't done so already. And as pointed out previously, I wanted to add that we recently installed Garry's The Colors of Citizen Arar back in July in the context of a permanent collection exhibition on our third floor, which is available to you today. So if you took the elevators to my left, you'd be able to find that piece there. Please stick around, enjoy Garry's art, enjoy the music that will continue to be played, and most importantly, enjoy one another's company. Thank you.